September 5, 1944. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt walked into his old headquarters building in the West for the first time in 2 months. He had been relieved of command in July, after telling Hitler's staff that the situation in Normandy was hopeless and recommending they make peace. Now Hitler was calling him back. That alone told von Rundstedt how desperate things had become. General Gunther Blumentritt, Chief of Staff for all German forces in the West, was waiting for him with maps spread across the table. The maps told a story of catastrophe. Allied forces had broken out of Normandy 6 weeks earlier. They were now racing across France faster than anyone had thought possible. Most of France had been liberated. American and British forces were approaching the German border. Blumentritt pointed to the southern sector of the front. The American Third Army under George Patton. In 3 weeks, Patton had covered over 400 miles. His forward elements were sitting just 100 miles from the German border with nothing substantial between them and the Rhine River. Von Rundstedt stared at the map. Then he asked the question whose answer he already knew. What do we have to stop him with? Blumentritt's answer was simple. Nothing. The German military situation in early September 1944 was desperate beyond anything most people understand. This wasn't just a retreat. This was the near-total collapse of German military power in Western Europe. Let's be specific about what von Rundstedt and Blumentritt were looking at on September 5th. Between Patton's forward positions and the German border, there were no intact German divisions. None. The Wehrmacht units that had been fighting in France were either destroyed, scattered, or fleeing east in disorder. Most had abandoned their heavy equipment. Those that still had some organization were combat ineffective. The famous Siegfried Line, Germany's western defensive fortifications, had been stripped of troops and weapons years earlier to supply the Eastern Front. The concrete bunkers were still there, but they were empty. No ammunition, no troops, no supplies, just concrete shells that would offer no resistance to an armored attack. To understand the German mindset, you have to visualize the roads. It wasn't an army anymore. It was a mob. German officers described scenes of total disintegration, columns of trucks burning, horse-drawn carts overturned in ditches, soldiers throwing away their rifles to run faster. There was no radio contact, no orders, just a collective primal instinct to get across the Rhine before the Americans caught them. For a German officer class that prided itself on discipline, this wasn't just a defeat. It was a humiliation. Years after the war, German commanders were remarkably candid about just how weak they were in early September. In post-war analysis and interrogations conducted by U.S. Army historians, they provided specific details that make clear how vulnerable they were. General Siegfried Westphal, who served as operations officer at OB West headquarters, later estimated in his book that on September 1, 1944, the entire Western Front had the effective combat strength of roughly 10 to 12 divisions. That sounds like a lot until you understand what it actually meant. A German division at full strength was supposed to have about 17,000 men, but these weren't full-strength divisions. Most were battered remnants with 2,000 to 5,000 men. They were short on ammunition, fuel, and heavy weapons. Many didn't have artillery support. Against this, Patton's Third Army alone had 12 divisions, most at near full strength, well supplied, and supported by complete air superiority. The math was brutal. Even if every German division had been at full strength and well positioned, they would have been outnumbered. But they weren't at full strength, and they definitely weren't well positioned. The most critical problem was reserves. In military terms, Reserves are units you keep back from the front line so you can respond to enemy breakthroughs or launch counterattacks. They're your insurance policy. On September 1st, 1944, Germany had no meaningful reserves in the West. Blumentritt testified in his interrogation that there were no panzer divisions available for immediate deployment anywhere between the English Channel and the Swiss border. The armored units that had fought in Normandy had been destroyed or were in the process of being rebuilt far behind the lines in Germany. The few panzer units still technically assigned to the West were either at 20% strength or were still forming and not combat ready. This was catastrophic because stopping an armored breakthrough required armored counterattacks. Infantry could dig in and hold ground, but they couldn't pursue and destroy advancing tank columns. For that, you needed panzers. And there weren't any. Westphal was blunt in his post-war testimony. Germany had no reserves, no fortifications, and no prepared positions. If Patton had continued his advance in early September, German forces could not have stopped him short of the Rhine, and possibly not even there. German intelligence was quite good at tracking Allied movements, even in the chaos of September 1944. They knew where Patton was. They knew his fuel situation was getting difficult. But they also knew that if he could solve his supply problems, nothing was going to stop him from reaching the Rhine. 2 days after returning to command, von Rundstedt sent a situation report to Hitler's headquarters. He had spent those 2 days assessing the front, and the news was worse than he'd feared. The report was remarkably pessimistic, even by the standards of late-war German military communications. Von Rundstedt stated that if the Americans continued their advance, German forces would be unable to prevent them from crossing the Rhine within 2 weeks. He requested immediate reinforcement with at least 10 fresh divisions, preferably armored. Hitler's headquarters responded by asking where these divisions would come from. The Eastern Front was fully committed against the Soviets. There were no strategic reserves. Von Rundstedt was told to do the best he could with what he had. That wasn't much. In early September, something happened that German commanders couldn't understand at first. Patton's advance slowed dramatically over the course of several days, then essentially stopped. Third Army units that had been racing forward at 30 to 40 miles per day were now sitting in place or moving only a few miles. German intelligence officers monitoring American radio traffic reported that Third Army was experiencing severe fuel shortages. Tanks were being immobilized. Combat operations were being curtailed. The Americans were consolidating their positions rather than pushing forward. Blumentritt later recalled in his interrogation that German commanders initially thought it must be a deception, that Patton was preparing for a massive thrust and wanted them to think he was having supply problems. But as the days passed and Third Army remained largely stationary, German commanders realized this wasn't deception. This was real. Patton had been stopped by logistics, not by German resistance. The relief in von Rundstedt's headquarters was palpable. For the American tankers, this moment was surreal. For weeks, their world had been noise. Engines roaring, tracks clanking, the adrenaline of the chase. Suddenly, everything went quiet. You had thousands of men sitting by the side of roads in the late summer sun, looking at maps that showed nothing ahead but empty space. They could feel that the enemy was broken. The road ahead was open. But the fuel gauges were empty. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was heavy. It was the feeling of a winning lottery ticket slipping out of your hand. In post-war interrogations and memoirs, German commanders describe what happened when Patton stopped advancing in early September in extraordinary terms. They used language suggesting they viewed it as miraculous. These were not religious men prone to superstition. They were professional military officers trained in tactical and strategic analysis, yet they used such language because they could find no rational military explanation for why Patton had stopped. German commanders referred to this period as the miracle of the West, using terminology that echoed how Germans had described unexpected salvation in World War I. Von Rundstedt wrote in his post-war memoir that the halt of Patton's Third Army in early September was inexplicable from a military standpoint. Patton had the strength, the position, and the momentum to reach the Rhine. That he did not do so was a gift Germany had no right to expect. Blumentritt was even more direct in his interrogation by American officers. He testified that when Patton was halted in early September, German commanders could not understand it. The Americans had stopped themselves at the moment when Germany was most vulnerable and least able to resist. The German commanders didn't waste the reprieve they'd been given. Between early September and the end of November 1944, they accomplished a remarkable reconstruction of their Western defenses. This wasn't speculation or post-war exaggeration. Allied intelligence documented it in real time and were alarmed by how quickly the Germans recovered. The first priority was getting troops to the Siegfried Line. Units that had been retreating in disorder were reorganized, re-equipped, and sent to man the bunkers. Training battalions from Germany were rushed forward. Even Luftwaffe ground personnel and Kriegsmarine sailors were formed into infantry units and sent to the west. By late September, the Siegfried Line had gone from being an empty concrete shell to being a genuine defensive position. The second priority was rebuilding panzer divisions. Tank production in Germany was actually quite high in late 1944. The problem had been getting the tanks to the front and forming them into effective units. With the front temporarily stabilized, the Germans had time to rebuild their armored strength. By November, several panzer divisions that had been destroyed in Normandy were back at combat strength and positioned for counterattack. The German military kept meticulous records, even in defeat. Post-war analysis of their order of battle shows exactly which units were moved to the west during September and October 1944. This wasn't a mystery. The Germans documented everything, and Allied intelligence tracked most of it. Between September 5th and October 15th, 11 divisions were transferred from the Eastern Front, from occupation duties in Denmark and Norway, or from training areas in Germany to the Western Front. 5 of these were Panzer or Panzer Grenadier divisions with significant armor strength. These weren't world-beating units. Some were understrength, but they were intact, organized, and capable of defensive operations. Additionally, 15 new Volksgrenadier divisions were formed and sent west. These were lower-quality units made up of older men, young recruits, and recovered wounded. But they could man defensive positions, operate artillery, and delay enemy advances. In September, Germany had almost nothing in the west. By November, they had the equivalent of 30 divisions, enough to man the Siegfried Line and create a reserve for counterattacks. The most significant consequence of Patton stopping in September was that it gave Germany time to plan and prepare for the Ardennes offensive, later known as the Battle of the Bulge. This operation wasn't improvised. It required months of preparation, massive ammunition stockpiling, and the assembly of 3 armies totaling about 250,000 men. General Hasso von Manteuffel, who commanded the 5th Panzer Army in the Bulge, testified after the war that the operation would have been impossible if Third Army had continued advancing in September. The troops needed for the counterattack would have been committed to defending the Rhine. The fuel and ammunition would have been expended in defensive battles. The element of surprise would have been lost. But because the front stabilized in September, Hitler's staff had time to plan an ambitious counteroffensive. They assembled panzer divisions, stockpiled fuel, and identified a weak section of the Allied line in the Ardennes. The attack, launched on December 16, 1944, initially achieved complete surprise and drove a deep salient into American lines. It cost over 80,000 American casualties and delayed the Allied advance by 6 weeks. When Third Army finally received adequate fuel and supplies in late September, the situation had changed completely. The Germans, who had been retreating in panic weeks earlier, were now dug into prepared positions. The Siegfried Line was manned. Artillery was registered. Minefields were laid. Patton's advance resumed, but the character of the fighting was totally different. Instead of racing across open country against scattered resistance, Third Army was now conducting systematic attacks against fortified positions. Progress was measured in hundreds of yards per day instead of dozens of miles. Casualties were heavy. The weather turned bad, limiting air support. There was a tragic poetry to the weather in 1944. When Patton was racing across France, the sun was shining. It was the summer of liberation. But the moment the supplies arrived and the advance resumed, the rains came. The skies turned gray. The ground turned to mud. The optimism of August vanished. The men who might have ended the war in summer uniforms were now shivering in foxholes. The easy war was over. The grinding, ugly war had begun. What should have been a pursuit became a grinding attrition battle. Blumentritt noted in his interrogation that once the Siegfried Line was manned, Patton was dangerous but no longer unstoppable. German forces could trade space for time, conduct fighting withdrawals, and make him pay for every kilometer. In September, they couldn't have done any of that. George Patton finally crossed the Rhine River on March 22, 1945, more than 6 months after he'd been within striking distance of it. By that point, the war was nearly over. German resistance was collapsing. The opportunities that had existed in September were long gone. Patton knew it. In his diary entries from March 1945, he expressed frustration that the Rhine crossing had been delayed so long. He wrote that if Third Army had reached the Rhine in September 1944, German resistance would have collapsed and the war would have ended months earlier. He was probably right. The Germans certainly thought so. Westphal stated in his interrogation that if Patton had reached the Rhine in September, German forces could not have held. The psychological shock of American forces on German soil 6 months earlier would have been devastating. Combined with the Soviet advances in the East, it might have ended the war by Christmas 1944. After Germany's surrender, the U.S. Army conducted extensive interrogations of German commanders. The goal was to understand German decision-making and to learn lessons for future conflicts. These interrogations produced thousands of pages of testimony, much of it remarkably candid. The question of Patton's September halt came up repeatedly because American officers wanted to understand whether continuing the advance would have been feasible. The German answers were consistent and unambiguous. Von Rundstedt, Blumentritt, Westphal, and multiple division commanders all testified that Germany lacked the forces to stop Patton in early September. Colonel General Alfred Jodl, who had been chief of operations at Hitler's headquarters, was asked directly in interrogations whether Germany could have prevented Patton from reaching the Rhine if he'd continued his advance in early September. According to the interrogation records, Jodl stated that Germany had no reserves and the Siegfried Line was not manned. If Patton had continued, he would have reached the Rhine by mid-September at the latest. The testimony of German commanders allows us to understand what might have happened if Patton had been given the fuel to continue his advance. This isn't speculation. This is based on what the people who would have opposed him said they were capable of doing. If Third Army had reached the Rhine in mid-September, German forces would have been unable to establish a coherent defense. The Siegfried Line would have been outflanked. Panzer divisions wouldn't have had time to rebuild. The psychological impact on the German population of American forces on German soil in September rather than March would have been severe. The Battle of the Bulge would not have happened because Germany wouldn't have had the forces to attempt it. Those 80,000 American casualties could have been avoided. The war in Europe would likely have ended in late 1944 or early 1945, rather than May 1945. Historians debate the exact timeline, but German commanders' testimony provides strong evidence that Germany's position would have been untenable. Colonel General Jodl addressed this question in his interrogation. When asked if the war could have ended in 1944 with an unbroken Allied advance, he testified that the collapse of the Western Front would have been psychologically devastating. Combined with Soviet pressure in the East, it likely would have led to German surrender by early 1945 at the latest. German military professionals drew clear lessons from the September 1944 experience. In their post-war writings and teaching at military academies, they emphasized the importance of operational tempo. When you have an enemy on the run, you don't give them time to recover. You maintain pressure until they collapse completely. Blumentritt wrote a tactical study after the war that used September 1944 as a case study in defensive recovery. He explained in detail how Germany had been on the brink of total collapse and how the American pause had allowed recovery. His analysis concluded that logistics are important, but they cannot be allowed to halt an army at the moment of decision. An army that stops to wait for supplies gives its enemy the most precious gift possible: time. This wasn't just theoretical musing. It was based on the lived experience of commanders who had been on the receiving end of an operational pause that saved them. They knew exactly how valuable that time had been. They used every day of it to rebuild defenses that otherwise wouldn't have existed. When asked years after the war to assess the significance of Patton's September halt, Blumentritt was unequivocal in his testimony and writings. He described it as the single most important event of the campaign in the West after the Normandy invasion. Patton had broken the back of German resistance. They were in headlong retreat. They had no coherent defense. And then he stopped. Blumentritt's post-war analysis explained how German forces used those weeks in September and October to rebuild what had been destroyed. They brought in new divisions. They manned the Siegfried Line. They created reserves. By November, they had a functioning defensive line again. None of that would have been possible if Patton had kept coming. The testimony of German commanders makes one thing absolutely clear. They weren't stopped by German military prowess in September 1944. They weren't saved by brilliant defensive tactics or superior German training. They were saved by the American decision to halt Patton's advance while he waited for supplies. It was, in their own assessment, an unexpected reprieve that had no military justification. And they used that reprieve to extend the war by 6 months. We talk about buying time in military history as if it's a currency, but in 1944, that time was bought with lives. The 6 months that Germany gained didn't change the outcome of the war, but it changed who survived it. Because of that delay, tens of thousands of men on both sides who would have gone home to their families in 1944 instead died in the Hürtgen forest, or in the Ardennes snow, or at the crossing of the Rhine. That is the true weight of the September halt. It wasn't just a strategic error. It was a human tragedy.